G'day, welcome to Lunch Money. You are live with your online and social media home for special situations, workouts and capital raising professionals. My name is Nick Samios. I'm the fund manager and director here at Hermes Capital, and I am your Lunch Money host. And today, what a fun Lunch Money we have for you. We're going to be talking about outsmarting the crooks and con men. I tweeted a little bit earlier today when I was promoting that there's a lot of headlines in the last week about all sorts of financial malfeasance, and I said don't become a headline. And when I mean that, I don't mean don't be one of the crooks. I mean don't be one of the victims. And hopefully our special guest Wayne Gilbert will help you avoid that today. Before we introduce our topic more formally and introduce Wayne, I'd like to remind you, as usual, to ask a question. We're live, and so you have this unique opportunity to ask a question and to get one of these special Lunch Money mugs. Now, you'll notice that we've got this special Aegean Blue edition for anyone asking live questions today. So allow me to introduce Wayne Gilbert. Wayne is Integrity Principal at PKF here in Sydney. He's got 35 years as an investigator, including in the police force and also at accounting firms such as PKF. And he's seen all sorts of fraud, misconduct and corruption. He's also got experience hunting down criminals as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Wayne Gilbert. G'day, Wayne.
G'day, Nick. I'm well, mate. So excited to be here to talk about one of my favourite topics.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, the crime and fraud, it's all very salacious, isn't it? It's a bit hard to it's one of those things you can't look away from. Tell me two things. Firstly, what is your role at PKF, and what's the sort of stuff that keeps you busy lately?
Okay, so essentially I head up the integrity practice in Sydney as part of our broader national team. Our remit is around some risk management, investigations into fraud and other employee misconduct. And a large part of what we do also is managing whistleblower hotlines for some of our clients as well.
Okay. Well,
some of the things, I guess, that keep us busy and some of the things we're doing, and one of the things that never goes away is fraud and corruption in the procurement process. So we've got some matters ongoing in relation to how people deal with major procurements and some of the issues that occur as a result of that. And we've also got some behavioural matters going on. And, you know, behaviour, whilst some people don't classify that as fraud, we do, because we look at fraud as a very broad bucket, and misconduct in the workplace costs businesses a lot of money, and bullying and sexual harassment, I think, are very topical as well at the moment, and they cost businesses a lot of money over the long term.
And so I guess you're brought in when there's a PKF client somewhere in Australia that's got an issue. I know that you've also got a broader network of the smaller accounting practices. Obviously, not your suburban accounting practice can't afford to have an integrity principal such as yourself. So does it work like that also?
Well, it's not necessarily just our PKF clients as such. People reach out to us from all necks of the woods to investigate issues. But on the other side of that, we also do proactive work where we actually educate workforces in relation to some of the signs to look for, red flags, etc., and educate the workforce to be on what to be on the lookout for. Okay.
Now, look, I've got a little montage to introduce. This is our next session, so let's just have a quick look at that.
The case of the 49-year-old who pretended to be a financial whiz to fleece $25 million.
Allegations by anti-money laundering agency Austrac that Westpac failed to report 23 million potentially suspicious transactions.
Mr. Greensill, are you a fraudster?
No, Mr. Connor, I am not.
Yeah. So you're in a very hot space there. There's no question about it. It's in the news a lot of late. I guess I have a theory that whilst the economy has done pretty well during the pandemic, there is no doubt that at some point in time we are going to feel a lot more the financial consequences, and perhaps that's going to, perhaps as a result of that, we're going to see more financial malfeasance. You'd concur with that?
Oh, definitely. We're seeing some of it at the moment with, people working remotely and their behaviours whilst they're working remotely. And I guess one thing that comes to mind is, people filling in a timesheet indicating that they're working when they have no footprint on their work systems, etc., and they're actually not working. So we've been investigating a few of those.
Wow. So is that an issue with working from home? Are you suggesting, or?
Well, I think it's just an issue with people in general that, some people work well and others don't. And there is that tendency that if no one's looking, you don't necessarily abide by all the conditions that are there for you at work. So, it's a minority of people, but we still see it. And thankfully, some employers take note and they take action, which is a really good thing, that people actually look for these issues and then take action, because if you just let it slide, that's the position that you accept from your workforce, that nothing will happen to me if I just continue on with my behaviour.
That's interesting. Well, look, we're going to come back to behaviour, and I'm just going to jot down the word habitual there. It's interesting. My wife has made jokes in the past about, how do you know your sales reps aren't Uber driving, for example? And I'd like to think that they wouldn't be doing that because of the opportunity cost. But now it's interesting. You mentioned procurement fraud a little bit earlier. I remember I had a client in the printing business a number of years ago, and there was a marital issue. Husband and wife had effectively busted up, but they were both working together out of necessity. But I'm just trying to think how this worked. He would do deals with his mates who, for example, might be supplying paper, say, and they would overcharge on the invoices and sort of kick back to him. Is that the sort of procurement fraud you're talking about?
Well, there's that, and then there's undeclared conflicts of interest where it's basically jobs for your mates. So you tie up a deal with a supplier who you know, and not necessarily test the market as you should, and they start invoicing your organisation, and potentially there's a kickback there, or it's just looking after your mates.
Yeah, that looking after your mates is, that's a real fine line, isn't it? Particularly, say, in professional services. It's interesting, the quid pro quos. There are certain financial services, without going sort of naming names, where you're not supposed to be paying commissions or kickbacks, for example. But where does quid pro quo start and kickbacks kick in?
Well, I think it's all around the processes and procedures that you have in place, and at all times, really, your dealings with at a business level need to be on an appropriate business level. Kickbacks are not something that should really enter into the equation at all, and they shouldn't be tolerated. But just on that, Nick, one of the things around procurement fraud is, around the controls within an organisation, and we see, employees with an organisation right up to and including CFOs and CEOs able to bypass the controls and the onboarding of vendors. And this is a very important control, the onboarding and control around onboarding of vendors, and slip a company that they may be associated with into the system and start sending invoices through for services that haven't been rendered and taking money out of the business that way. That's a very common fraud.
That's very interesting. In fact, I'll just flash up a headline, which quite frankly, the story was too convoluted for me to understand. The ex-con, the CEO and the dodgy invoice was a story in the paper on the 12th. What's today? Today's the 16th, so on Tuesday. And this was a story where allegedly, of course, there was the CEO of a football club, I think it was looking to buy into a business, and there's allegedly questionable invoices were then passed through to the club that they were going to pay for the, so I guess that's the sort of thing you're talking about. I mean, that's obviously one permutation.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be up at that level of CEO. It can be anyone within the business who understands the environment and then can bypass that environment. And a lot of times that's what happens. People bypass the environment and no one wants to speak up about it.
Look, whilst we're talking about headlines, there's obviously the big story about the football boss at the centre of alleged Westpac fraud, and supposedly he was going to be returning to Greece. I think I'm not sure what date that article is from, but the latest I heard this morning was that he had COVID, so he had every intention of coming back to Australia, apparently. You were saying when we spoke earlier that you think the chances of him returning are pretty close to nil.
Well,
if you're a betting man.
Yeah, well, only through my previous experience. And if he doesn't return voluntarily, I think the chances of getting him back to this country are probably slim to zero.
Yeah. Well, you'd have to ask yourself, if you had $400 million in your back pocket, my understanding is that, and allegedly, none of this has been proven as yet, but the newspapers are talking, numbers that I've got from the newspapers, there's, I think, 200 and something million with Westpac, $100 million with Sumitomo, $9 million with Societe Generale, and then there's a fintech that I hadn't heard of before, but called Hum, that there's $12 million. So if you've got any of that money, converted into the old drachmas or euros, then you would have to wonder why you come back. But you've got some experience chasing people to Greece.
Yes, I mean, it's going back quite some time now, but had a person who was involved in a homicide here in Sydney that fled to Greece before we had enough information upon which to charge him. And we made several trips to Greece. He was had Greek heritage. His parents were born in Greece, and he claimed his Greek heritage, which you're allowed to do. And of course, under most treaties that we have with most countries, it's at the discretion of that country as to whether they give up their nationals. And the Greek authorities chose not to on this occasion. And whilst he didn't get away scot-free, we did try him in Greece, but it was a very, very difficult process. And he was subsequently acquitted in Greece, but that's another story for another day.
Wow. Okay. I was telling that story to one of my partners the other day, and he said, "What happened in the end?" Okay. Well, so that's what happened, more or less. The short version is that he was acquitted, but you got to spend some time in Greece anyway, which wouldn't have been too tough, I'm sure. I'm just wondering, that we've got some topics that we wanted to talk about, and I'm not sure which one of these, whether or not we're going to be talking about culture or behaviour, but I'm wondering what goes on at a bank, and let's not talk specifically about this, but we're a bank, we've got someone who's introducing, business to us in the order of hundreds of millions. And I mean, how is it that something like this in this day and age gets passed? I'm imagining someone at a bank saying, "Listen, I found this thing that's a bit questionable," and someone else saying, "Well, you can't ask him that. What are you going to do? Accuse him of fraud?" Is this how does it happen in this day and age?
Well, I think that it's been going on forever and ever. And if we're talking about asset leasing and issues that happen, I mean, been involved in a few of those going back several years. And I think it's really about the controls that are in place and how hard one kicks the tires, and what that goes back into the risk appetite of the organisation about, well, at what point do we actually get up off a chair and go out and investigate whether those assets exist versus some small due diligence around that.
Yeah, I mean, supposedly in this case, the people who were supposedly receiving the benefit of the goods just didn't know anything about it. And I suppose if you get away with one, you get away with 10, you get away, and these things escalate. I mean, it reminds me of when I was at AGC back in the 80s. And the classic was that one of the officers working for AGC would come up with a dummy loan lending themselves money. And then, of course, in order to make the payments on that dummy loan, they'd have to write another dummy loan. And then they'd need to write another dummy loan to make the payments. And it wasn't until they went on holidays that they'd get caught out. But, these are all war stories. There's the war. I don't know if you remember the case of Tonal Tonal was one of those big equipment frauds. There was the John Friedrich story. What was the name of his company? National Security, National Safety Council. I mean, so these are all war stories that, you know, that people must be. I know that when I was working in large institutions, we were telling these stories to each other all the time. So what is it in the culture that allows this to keep going on?
Well, I don't know that it's typically what I would refer to as culture. I think it's more in the risk management and how organisations deal with risk. And as I said, at what point does an organisation go out and kick the tyres? And I talk about kicking the tyres because it reminds me of a large fraud on the mid-north coast of New South Wales around buses. And the organisation were getting loans on all of these buses that didn't actually exist. And, one of the issues was that there was an insider in the organisation that was assisting by just passing off that the inspections had been done. So these guys were just recycling VIN numbers and no real testing was ever done to see whether the assets existed.
I know that you like to talk about trust being no substitute for control. Is this what we're talking about here?
Well, no, I think that's just out and out fraud. With an insider who's not actually doing their job for the organisation and not actually going to check that the assets actually exist before the money leaves the organisation.
Okay. Well, look, let's talk about some of the specific areas that we're going to talk about. Let's talk about the corporate culture. Now, you talk about the speak up culture. What's that about?
Well, I think that it's the culture that allows people to actually feel free to have a voice within an organisation and speak up about whether it's fraud, whether it's about bad behaviour, and feel that they've been listened to and that some action will come of it without retribution to them. And if we look back through the history of whistleblowers in this country and probably even globally, we can see that we're not there yet in many instances, and people do find it difficult at times to speak up without the fear of retribution. And us running whistleblower hotlines where we get people that come through and they definitely want to remain anonymous because they're concerned about their role if it's known that they're speaking up.
There's the old saying, if you come for the king, you best not miss. So I suppose I know myself, I remember very early on in my career having an issue with one of my bosses, and I went and spoke to his boss and, basically just wanted to brush it under the carpet and dismiss it. And I soon realised that, it was more jeopardy to me to sort of pursue it any further than it was to anybody else. I can't remember what the specifics were or how serious it might have been. But so how do you encourage the right culture? I mean, how do you encourage people? Well, what do you say to people to encourage them to blow the whistle, to put their mind at ease that they're not going to be victims along the way?
Well, I think that, Australia's come a long way in that they've passed some legislation that came into effect about a year ago now in relation to the protection for people coming forward. But it's really about what one of your guests a couple of weeks ago said, Dr. Peter Ellis, about culture and the tone at the top. It shouldn't really matter whether you're the last person hired or the person that's been within the organisation for 20 years, whether you're the CEO or the CFO. People look to the role models and the behaviours that people put out there, and you've got to walk the walk, and that's what CEOs need to do. And it reminds me, even going back to the Coles-Myer fraud, which is a multi-million-dollar fraud, of which Brian Quinn, who was the CEO of Coles back in those days, and Paul Coughlin, who was the chief prosecutor on that matter, his quote's a gem, I think. He said, when they saw their boss with his nose in the trough, they just got right in alongside of him. And that's that whole culture of the top. Well, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Okay.
Look, I'd actually like you to tell us a little bit more about that. But before before we do go there, I would just like to remind anyone who's watching us live that this Aegean blue interior coffee mug is yours if you pop us a question. And it also, in the spirit of being able to speak freely, I encourage you to share, like, subscribe our podcast and live stream, and don't forget to hit the notification bell as well. That way, when we produce fresh content, you will be reminded. So tell me, are you able to tell us a little bit more about that specific case?
About Brian Quinn? Well, Brian Quinn was the CEO of Coles quite a long time ago now, and he stole millions and millions of dollars from Coles. And what was revealed during his trial down in Victoria was a person who just had no scruples and no real ethical compass, because he was so arrogant that I think he one of the key things that happened was he built this massive home down in Victoria, and he put more than one new kitchen in it, because when he built one new kitchen, apparently his wife didn't like one of them, so they scrapped it and built another one. So just totally kind of reprehensible behaviour and total lack of integrity in dealing with what was the money that belonged to his organisation.
Well, sometimes big shots think they're above the law.
You think because you're a celebrity that somehow the law doesn't apply to you, that you're above the law?
I guess maybe there was a little bit of that going on. I suppose do they think that no one's going to have the temerity or the guts to come after them?
Well, I think so, but I think that he was able to get away with it, and not only was he able to get away with it, but the rest of his comrades joined him, and if you've got your whole executive team doing that, well, you've got no chance.
Now, I've got a question here from an anonymous LinkedIn user. Let's just see what that says. What advice would you give to an institution that focuses their confidence on the ability of their customer applicant to repay their finance as opposed to if an asset or end product actually exists? Mostly if it is unfeasible for an institution to kick tires in every asset finance transaction.
Absolutely, and it's really around risk management there. I think it's really about at what point and what due diligence do you need to do in relation to finance. And I think too, if you're talking about the ability of their customer or their applicant to repay, well, to me, that's a given in any kind of responsible lending thing, that they're the checks and balances that should be done. Not that stops people from putting forward false documentation to secure loans, but that's just another story. But, that due diligence process around responsible lending in itself generally takes care of that.
Yeah, it's funny, you would think these days with technology, you'd be able to circumvent a lot of this stuff. If they didn't get the goods, did they at least get the invoice? I mean, where there's no goods involved at all, there's surely got to be better ways. Tell me, so we've talked a little bit about the speak up. Just quickly, so do you sort of provide an outsource of whistleblower hotline? I mean, do you set up a hotline for your customers that a phone rings next to your desk? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, we do a few things around whistleblowing. We definitely have a hotline. We've got about 30 clients with an independent hotline, so they get their own number, and we also have a link to so that people can report online. Some people, not that we get too many these days, even we still get the odd letter that comes through, but they're few and far in between. So we run a very secure back-end portal. So we receive the calls, we take those calls, and then we pass that information back on to those people so that they can deal with it. We also can triage that information and assess it for clients if they would like us to. And of course, we can also investigate those matters.
Okay.
And we're also working closely with a number of people which I think is the most important part. I think the new legislation that came through in relation to whistleblowers said that you need to have a whistleblower policy. But there are some real issues behind whistleblower policies where you can get into trouble. And that is how you handle those disclosures when they come through. and how you maintain confidentiality and prevent reprisals. And we're working with a number of people now to help them build better systems behind the scenes to help them manage that process better.
Okay. I mean, that sounds like a legal quagmire, I must say, with all sorts of liabilities flying in every direction. Look, Chris Slack has given us a bit of a follow-up question on this alleged fraud with respect to Westpac. And it's interesting because another friend of mine asked this as well. Obviously this fraud, it could be in the order of $400 million spread over a number of financiers, and who knows if more won't pop up. And as I said to you, another one popped up today. But I wonder what impact this will have generally across the market. Where I think again, there's this thing where there's one thing where the bank is lending directly to the customer itself, but then there's another thing when they're lending to their customers' customers, really. I think that was what was going here with this Westpac situation. Westpac wasn't lending, as far as I know, to Pappas's organisation. It was lending to his customers who were buying his services. So, then there's this whole thing of, well, is that second-tier market that is getting money from banks and then having that money provided to their customers? I mean, do you think that you'll get people calling you, asking you to help out in those situations?
Well, again, I think it's you never know. That there may be some major frauds identified through that process. But again, look, risk management's a moving feast. And, where risks are identified, well, people need to then go back to tin tacks and look at, well, how does that impact on our business and what are we going to do to prevent this from happening to us, kind of thing. And that should always be happening. Okay. These things aren't static.
All right, well, thank you very much for your question there, Chris. Now, we'll get one more question before we move on to our next talking point. We've got Linda Lee. Thank you very much for your question, Linda. Hi, Wayne. Have you seen a decrease in disclosures coming through with more people working from home? So I don't know if this relates maybe to the whistleblowing type scenario. How does working from home impact these areas? Thank you very much, Linda, for your question.
No, we're pretty steady in relation to disclosures, because I think it's a mixture of where people are still working on site and people are working from home. So we've been pretty steady with disclosures that are coming through our lines over the COVID period.
Now, having said that, we were talking a little bit earlier before we went live. I was asking you about, whether or not you thought that when we do see the financial consequences, and there will be financial consequences to the economy, just not yet, of this pandemic, whether or not you think you'll see, an increase in the level of financial malfeasance. I think I gave you the quote of an old friend of mine, Alan Kay, used to say, people are as honest as they are profitable. And you said that you were reflecting on your experience from the GFC. Yeah,
and the GFC, I think that, following the GFC, 12 to 18 months following the GFC, we saw, an uptick in fraud cases coming forward. But, if you look at the statistics, and there's an organisation called the Certified Fraud Examiners, who are a global organisation, and, they talk about, most fraud schemes take up to 18 months to come to the surface because we're not particularly good at identifying them. And, I always caution where I have someone say to me, oh, there's no fraud here to be seen. Having that attitude tells me that A, you're not looking, and B, that you generally have a very trusting attitude towards things, and that there may be questions around the control environment. And the other thing is that you're not actually training people in what they need to look for. And, that's one of the key things to prevent fraud. And even if it's not in a business sense, if it's in your personal sense, I mean, I'm the victim of fraud or attempted fraud overnight on my credit card. So it can happen to anyone in any circumstance. And, we talk about the Westpacs of the world and $200 million here and $1 million there. But if we look at the impact of fraud, $100,000 can be quite damaging dependent upon the size of the business.
Sure. I mean, look, I don't know how many times We're talking to someone who's got cash flow issues in their business, and it's been the result of a bookkeeper, who's made off with some of the money, or general manager or whatever. And I use the old Greek shopkeeper saying that the owner's always got to keep an eye on the till. Listen, we've got two talking points. I don't want to run out of time to get to these, so let me just move quickly to them. One of them was on this. We were talking about email fraud. I think I've got a headline here. It might have been an older headline about email fraud. You were talking about, in this particular article, it was talking about this thing where, for example, I know myself, I've received an email from my financial controller saying that I need to pay a bill. Now, it's a bit odd because we're a pretty small organisation, and the way it was worded, it was obviously a fraudulent email. But I guess people are hacking into emails and seeing what the relationships people have with each other, and maybe knowing, getting a little bit of information to help them pull off one of these frauds.
Yeah, look, this is a massive global business. It's a billion dollar business, business email compromise. Now, you mentioned the CEO style fraud where someone sends a direction internally for someone to facilitate a payment on behalf of the CEO or CFO, etc. And they still happen where some people don't talk to each other and the payments get released. To people hacking into email, and it might not be within your business, it might be external to the business. They hack into a business transaction, and then they change some of the bank account details. They're not checked, and lo and behold, what was assumed to be a legitimate payment is forwarded to a completely foreign account. And in general terms, that money goes pretty quickly. If you're lucky, you might get it clawed back. But in the world of instantaneous finance transactions, often the money's gone.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that they do their homework and understand the patterns. I guess if they're as you say, they may only be hacking into someone else's email, but they're establishing the nature of communications and what sort of things. So you get involved in that in that sort of work as well?
Yes, we do. We're involved in that from time to time, and I think that one of the things that we need to be aware of is that it's not if you'll ever be the victim of cyber fraud, it's when you'll be the victim of cyber fraud, and you need to do a lot. I draw an analogy going back to it. You might remember the old Nigerian letter scams and and those kind of scams, and after they'd been well publicised, people still fell for those scams and still had that hope that that there was a bucket of money at the end of the rainbow. Well, if you bring that back to cyber, we should be training our people. If you receive an email that's unsolicited, don't open it, or don't click on the link that's in it. But people still do, and fraudsters are getting smarter. These cyber fraudsters are smarter. They now disguise links where they can download malware into your system into what look like a PDF document. But again, the simple question, the simple thing is, if you've received a strange email that you weren't expecting and it's asking you to do stuff, delete it. Because you know what? Because someone will contact you if it was actually that important.
Yeah, I was in one of the articles I was reading as homework for this today. You get those angry emails. If you don't pay this, something terrible is going to happen. From the ATO, there's a lot of ATO type scams. I need to ask you, because I did see. We captured a bit of what I would call fraud here last year, about this time last year. It was maybe for about $40,000 or $50,000, where we'd been told to pay to a particular bank account, which we were told was the bank account of the ATO, to help a client meet a tax obligation. Now, the money, that night I got a phone call from our bank. It was an NAB. They were very, I don't know what systems they're running there, but they've rung me and said, this payment's not going to the ATO. So I don't know what they've looked at the coding, the narrative we put on the payment. And it turned out it was a fraud. Now, I reported that thing. I've heard nothing. No one's followed up on it. So at what level, and I know speaking to people in the insolvency trade, for example, they often come across frauds, but if they, sometimes it's just not worth reporting it because, what's going to happen? At what level, should you report every single fraud, or is there a point where the authorities just aren't interested? If it's not $1 million, they don't care. That seems to be the anecdotal case. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's an obligation to report. It's how much expectation you place on having small frauds investigated. But if you don't report, then people just don't know, or the police and law enforcement around the country don't know what's going on. Your small fraud might be a part of a jigsaw puzzle of a much larger issue, and it's difficult. And saying that people aren't interested, if you look at fraud and a lot of these external fraud and a lot of these scams, they're perpetrated from someone who's sitting in a basement in Romania. And I don't pick on Romania for anything, but, there's jurisdictional issues. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes in, and it's very hard to commit resources for a $50 fraud. And, there are those things that are really high volume, low dollar type frauds, and they're extremely difficult to investigate down to, the bank caught it. Did the bank actually report that activity as a fraud, or did they just take it as, well, we've actually prevented it, so it hasn't gone through and we've done our job?
I think in this case they did. There was some level of reporting going on, and it's not the first time. That specific circumstance. Look, the clock is running down. Just out of curiosity, okay, so you're saying you've got an obligation to report every fraud. It is just a legal obligation anyway, and it could be just one. It might only be 50,000 to you, but it could be part of some great big plot for millions, and it might be the missing piece of information. I suppose it helps the authorities catch the perpetrators. But anecdotally, at what level do you think ASIC picks up a file? Is it $1 million, $500,000, or repeat offenders only, or?
Well, I'm not sure that it's an ASIC role as opposed to a law enforcement role. Various police jurisdictions around the country, and they all have different resourcing and different appetites for how they get involved in matters. So it's difficult to say. Okay.
Now, look, I do want to, before we sort of wrap up, you were saying that you were talking about crime in the workplace that is ostensibly non-financial, but can later on have serious financial impacts. And you were talking about bullying and other sorts of bad workplace behaviours. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think bullying and sexual harassment are very big and topical at the moment. And, we're even seeing them, via means of people whilst they're not in the workplace, going back to that question before about, disclosures coming through, where people are omitted from email trails and not invited to meetings and the like. But down to really poor behaviours where you've got, people yelling at each other, people not treating each other with the appropriate respect. And it brings me back to a story where I was out actually investigating, bullying behaviour, and one person had made an allegation against another, and then there were cross allegations made about that other. But I actually witnessed this particular person who had allegations made about having a stand-up toe-to-toe exchange with their supervisor, and the HR representative in that place was standing no more than 3 metres away from it and did nothing about it. And it's kind of like the behaviour was abhorrent, and it's kind of like, well, you get what you stand for. So if you're prepared to walk past that kind of behaviour, that's what you get. And the other thing that bears that out is that a lot of people that I spoke to during that investigation said, oh, that's just the way that person is. They've been here for years and they're just like that. But the behaviour shouldn't be tolerated. We need to stand up and do stuff about that, because at the end of the day, there's probably 10 people that have left that workplace because of the behaviour of that person. That in itself has all the financial costs of rehiring and retraining and all of that. Plus, then there's all the morale and performance issues that go in with that. So if you look at it and say, well, it's not a financial matter, they're huge financial matters, plus all the workers' compensation claims, etc., that come through.
Well, not to mention that people who are being mistreated are going to be less incentivised to keep an eye out on all those other sorts of malfeasance that we've talked about. Why should I speak up about this? And all that sort of stuff. I think we were talking about top-down culture. In any case, listen, we're actually out of time. So I'll just sort of any sort of closing comments or closing thoughts that people watching this they should be doing to make sure that they don't become victims.
Well, you can only protect yourself so much from the external, but training. You should be training your workforce and what to look for. And in a real sense, look, they're the eyes and ears within your organisation, and also promoting a culture that says it's okay for you to speak up. And simply put, in a very short thing, training people, making them aware what they need to look for, and ensuring that they do have a voice to speak up.
Okay. Well, Wayne Gilbert from PKF, thank you so much for your giving us a view into your world and what it is that someone in your role does from day to day. And thanks for your advice and tips. What have we got here? Outstanding session, Nick and Wayne from our good friend Tony Doyle. Thank you very much for your comment there, Tony. And thank you very much. Thanks to our viewers and our listeners. And we'll do it all again next week. Thank you and cheers.